Hello, and welcome to the third talk brought to you by the Friends of the Wembdon Road Cemetery in association with the Blake Museum. This week we'll be looking at the burial crisis of the 1840s, and fair warning to you, this will be fairly grim stuff, even in the context of a series about death. A lot of this story is based upon Tony Rulrich's study of public health and water supply in 19th century Bridgwater, which you can read from the link in the description to this video, and is well worth a read. So I've made the point over the last two videos that burial practice hadn't really changed much over the centuries. Unlike the early medieval burials on Wembdon Hill, where you had one burial per grave, over the Middle Ages the limited space within a churchyard meant that over time, once somebody was forgotten, graves would be dug up and reused. Bones would either be collected and placed at the bottom of a new burial, or else they would be collected and placed in the charnel house of the church. Although the new dissenting burial grounds had created more space, they were only open to members of those congregations, and they were all quite small. Most of the people of Bridgwater could not afford to pay for their own burial, and so were paid at the expense of the parish, meaning they had to go into St Mary's churchyard. Now all this was fine while the town was a fairly static size, but three things combined to create a perfect, disgusting storm. The first was that the town's population mushroomed. Population was about 3,364 in 1801. But as the 19th century wore on, the town's population exploded, so by 1841 it had reached 10,450. So in the space of 40 years the population had nearly tripled. We can look at the maps of Bridgwater over this period, and although we see some slight expansion of the town outside the medieval boundaries, we don't see a tripling of that size. So many more people were living in the same space. And in the days before running water, lots of houses would have relied on communal wells for their drinking and washing water. Sanitation was mostly a matter of digging a pit in the garden or having an ash pile and occasionally clearing the contents of these into the river. All of this created thoroughly unsanitary conditions. A major cause of this population growth came with the nature of Bridgwater itself. Historically, Bridgwater had three main functions. It was a port, it was a market town, and it was a communications hub for travellers. Starting in the 18th century and massively intensifying in the early 19th century, Bridgwater also became an industrial centre, especially with the new brick and tile industry. This industry required workers, so people from the surrounding countryside came to the town for work. The industry also intensified the old town's functions, so communications in particular were revolutionised. First in 1835 when the floating harbour, known to us as the docks, were begun, and then in 1841 when the Bristol and Exeter Railway reached Bridgwater. This was extended down to Taunton in 1842 and then to Exeter in 1845. The population growth, combined with people moving around, came the second major crisis point for burial in Bridgwater, that of disease. There was an outbreak of smallpox in 1833, which killed around 40 people, but the crowning horror was that of cholera. This was a particularly nasty killer waterborne disease, brought to Britain via trade with India, which symptoms included very violent vomiting and diarrhoea. In 1832, between October and December, some 178 people died of cholera. A second wave hit the town in August 1848 and would kill a total of 235 in the district. This latter outbreak is well recorded. It apparently reached the town via a vagrant known as Vosper, who had been travelling from London to Lisgard. He became violently ill on the road and was ultimately taken to the Bridgwater workhouse. Once there, the disease spread to the poor inmates. So the cholera outbreak started in the workhouse on the 5th of August. By the 14th of August, Eastover had also seen an outbreak, and ultimately 8 people would die there during this epidemic. By the 3rd of September, Gold's Buildings in Northgate had an outbreak, and there were ultimately 9 deaths there. Pricketts Lane also had an outbreak on the same day, where ultimately 13 died. On 8th of September, the disease spread to Honeysuckle Alley, now Clare Street, where ultimately 9 died. By the 14th of September, it had spread to Moat Lane, where ultimately 7 people died. The next day, West Street was struck, and ultimately up to 30 people died, with 17 more people in adjoining Albert Street. The disease went into abeyance at the end of September, but returned as a result of people coming to the town of Bridgwater for the annual fair. Why the fair was allowed to go ahead despite the nationwide crisis is unknown. Some dodgy contaminated oysters peddled to the poor of the town, caused a second terrible outbreak in Eastover. In early October, the epicentre became Monmouth Street, where 19 deaths in total are recorded. From there it spread to the Bath Road, where there was a total of 9 deaths, and Bristol Road, where there was 29 deaths, and finally Union Street, where there were 13 deaths, with many other scattered cases around the town. St Mary's Church records specifically mention 58 burials caused as a result of death caused by cholera. Up to 20 burials took place at Holy Trinity, and a total of 88 burials took place at St John's Church in Eastover. 33 of these burials took place in a single pit, and the rest were buried in their own individual plots. A memorial was erected in front of the pit, which can still be seen although heavily worn, and the late Dr. Peter Catmull arranged for a new stone to join it in 2013. The inscription reads, "In memory of the decease of 88 persons from cholera 1849. From plague, pestilence and sudden death, good Lord, deliver us." Because there wasn't enough burial space in Bridgwater, during the peak of the crisis, the tranquil churchyard of Chiltern Trinity to the north of Bridgwater had to also be pressed into service, and ultimately some 51 Bridgwater folk who died of cholera were taken there for burial. In the first half of the 19th century, the churchyard of Chiltern Trinity became something of a dumping ground for St Mary's Church, as the charnel house was often emptied when it became full, and the bones taken out to Chiltern Trinity and dumped in a pit in the churchyard there. Yet emergencies aside, the town's burial needs on an ordinary basis were completely inadequate. Despite an industrialised explosion in the population and dreadful mortality crises, the town was ultimately depending on a medieval system of burial. The newspapers of the 1840s contain horrific stories about the condition of St Mary's. The burial ground of St Mary's covers about half an acre. At the time, this amount of land was estimated to sustainably accommodate up to 136 burials a year, and there was only 1 year for the entire 1840s where this figure was not exceeded. On the 3rd of January 1848, an anonymous letter to the Bridgwater Times made this very point, and parts of it are worth quoting in full to convey the horror of the observations. So, the sanitary condition of Bridgwater. To the editor of the Bridgwater Times. Sir, in accordance with your desire for the purpose of carrying out the promise you made in the last number of your publication, in reference to the sanitary condition of Bridgwater, the state of Enon Chapel in London, which must be familiar to your readers, a description of it having appeared in your columns, is not more disgusting, it is not more revolting to humanity, than is the state of the burial place belonging to St Mary's Church in the centre of the town of Bridgwater. So far back as 1842, this burial ground was considered inadequate in extent, and yet, from that period to the present, have burials continued to be performed in it. The ground is so full of bodies that the surface is strewn with bones, and when a fresh grave is dug, skulls and arms and leg bones are thrown onto the surface, and the decency of reinterring or removing them from the public gaze is not always observed. Nor is this all. On one occasion, a grave was dug when portions of a coffin and its contents were thrown on the surface, the body not yet decomposed, flesh still adhering to portions of the bones, hair still attached to the flesh, the teeth and jawbones perfect. This was the body of a young female, a pauper, and in the desecration of her grave was violated all the sacred rights of religion and humanity, equally as though the ashes of one had been disturbed on whom in life fortune had deigned to smile. There is another disgusting spectacle frequently witnessed here. The gravedigger, with a long and heavy iron bar, may at times be seen seeking a spot to deposit some fresh body. Previous of a grave being opened, this bar, sharpened at one end, is thrust into the ground, to ascertain whether the body already deposited there are sufficiently decayed to permit a fresh grave to be dug. If so, the bones of the previous corpse are thrown onto the surface to vitiate the atmosphere and generate disease, and if not, the body in the ground is probably disturbed and revoltingly mangled. I say, sir, this churchyard is equally disgusting with Enon Chapel, the only difference being that the decency of secrecy was observed in the one, and when its catacomb of bones was discovered to the public, that secrecy gave it an additional horror. But in the other, no veil has been thrown over it, and its very publicity has protected it from the notice that would otherwise have been drawn to it. No whitewashing, no ventilation, no means which human power can employ can affect a healthy condition in the houses which surround this reeking plague spot. You may do all that the mind can devise to improve them, but so long as burials are permitted here, you cannot shut out the gaunt spectre of disease. This, sir, is not an unsupported assertion. It is, and has long been, the opinion of medical men belonging to the town. I cannot refrain from stating that, a short time since, some children gathered together a number of bones from the surface of the churchyard, took them into the street, and piled them in a heap under the wall which supports the iron railing. They did this for the purpose of playing with them. I remain, sir, yours, an inquirer. Another letter to the Times of the 28th of March 1850 described, to the editor of the Bridgwater Times. Sir, having frequently seen remarks in your paper setting forth many public nuisances, I beg respectfully to call to the attention to the authorities of the town, with the medical gentlemen, to the fact of the frequent opening of new-made graves in St. Mary's churchyard, on the north side of the church, where it is not unusual to see a new grave opened within 48 hours, and it has occurred within 24, of the burial of a corpse, and repeated 2 or 3 times in the same grave. There are now 4 graves beside each other, containing 15 or more bodies, all buried within a few months, and in one grave near the other lies a body not more than 2.5 feet below the surface of the earth. At the present time there is a grave lying open since Friday last, 22nd instant. Is not this sufficient to breed cholera or any other disease in the town? Does not this call for a new burial ground to prevent a repetition of such revolting scenes? I am, sir, yours, a ratepayer. As many of the remains were dug up were not fully decomposed, those ending up thrown into the charnel house of St. Mary's Church caused a thoroughly unhealthy pit, to the extent that the stench could be smelt in the pews above during church service, making churchgoers ill. Now, Bridgwater's experience was not untypical of the rest of Britain, although it was perhaps a little worse than the average. Nationwide campaigns had begun, such as the National Society for the Abolition of Burials in Towns, who had written to the Bridgwater Times in 1847. The leading proponent of sorting the horrible situation in St. Mary's Churchyard out was not the vicar and the churchwarden. They were in the unfortunate situation where a good proportion of their income was dependent on burial fees. Instead, the agitation was led by a solicitor of the town who worked in a room overlooking the churchyard from the High Street. He was called Richard Smith, Jr. There were a number of heated public meetings held in the town to discuss the matter. At a meeting which was held in February 1848, the Reverend Nimmill had excused himself for the state of the churchyard, saying that as he was not present at the digging of the graves, many things will have escaped his notice, although he conceded that a new burial ground would be needed in some form, even if it meant him losing fees. Different options were mooted, but Smith was the most assertive in advocating a large, open, out-of-town burial ground. He reiterated a number of complaints about St. Mary's, then roused the crowd, stating, I demand a burying place for the dead. I assert the right of the poor man to 6 feet of English ground, that when dead his body should not be desecrated, and that he should rest in peace in his grave. Subsequent meetings became increasingly fraught, and Smith, on one occasion, outraged, turned on the vicar to declare, I lay down this proposition, that it is the right of every Englishman to have a place to be buried in, and, being buried, that no mortal being has the right to touch his remains, that they shall remain undisturbed until the resurrection morning. That principle, which I contend for, has been broken over and over again by you, sir, in the parish of Bridgwater. Fortunately, eventually a plan was set in motion to create a large out-of-town cemetery, which is now the Wembdon Road Cemetery, which will be completed in 1851 and will be the focus of the next video. As always, you can support the Friends by visiting our website, you can like and subscribe to this page, and you can buy the books, and the links are in the description below. In the meantime, wishing you all the very best.